she told me to hand over the deed to my house. Right there at the dinner table, in front of my brother, my sister-in-law, and 14 other people I had known for most of my life. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't throw anything. I picked up my glass of iced tea, took a slow sip, and set it down. Then I made a phone call that changed everything. My name is not important. What matters is that I am 64 years old. I built something from nothing, and I watched my son stand beside his wife while she tried to take it from me. Let me go back to the beginning, because the story doesn't start at that Thanksgiving table. It starts about 30 years earlier in a garage in Decatur, Georgia, where I was putting in 16-hour days trying to turn a small HVAC business into something real. My wife, Eleanor, used to bring me dinner out there. She'd pull up a folding chair and sit with me while I worked, not saying much, just being there. We were broke in the way that young people are broke when they're building something. Not hopeless, just stretched. She believed in what we were doing. I don't think I ever told her enough how much that meant to me. By the time our son, Cooper, was born, things had started to turn. By the time he started middle school, we had 11 employees. By the time he graduated high school, we had a fleet of service vehicles, a commercial division, and a reputation in 3 counties. Eleanor and I weren't wealthy by any stretch of the imagination of people who have real money, but we were comfortable. We owned our home outright, a 4-bedroom colonial on 2 acres outside Alpharetta. We had savings. We had security. We had built it together, stud by stud, and invoice by invoice. Eleanor passed 8 years ago, pancreatic cancer, 12 weeks from diagnosis to the end. I will not spend much time on that part, because even now, putting it into words feels like pressing on a bruise that never quite healed. What I will say is that after she was gone, I held on to that house the way you hold on to anything that still smells like the person you lost. Her garden was still out back. Her cookbooks were still on the shelf in the kitchen. I kept her reading glasses on the nightstand for almost a year before I could bring myself to put them away. Cooper was 26 when his mother died. He cried at the funeral, and I believed it was real, and maybe it was. I want to be fair to my son. He was not always the person he became. There was a time when he was a good kid, curious, funny, the kind of boy who used to follow me around the job site asking questions about everything. I don't know exactly when that changed. I think it was gradual, the way erosion works. You don't notice until the ground gives way. He met Vanessa about 3 years after his mother passed. She was from money, not old money, but the kind of money that comes with the assumption that more money is always owed to you. Her father had sold a chain of car dealerships and retired to a condo in Ponte Vedra Beach. Her mother did not work and had not worked in 20 years. They were pleasant to me at first, in that careful way people are pleasant when they are evaluating what you're worth. I remember her father shaking my hand at the first dinner and asking very pointed questions about the business, revenue, employee count, whether I had considered franchising. I thought he was just making conversation. I understand now he was taking inventory. Cooper proposed to Vanessa 14 months after they met. He called me on a Thursday night, and I congratulated him. And I meant it. I wanted him to be happy. Eleanor would have wanted that too. I offered to pay for the wedding. It was not a small offer. I put $250,000 into a joint account that Cooper controlled, specifically designated for the wedding and nothing else. I told him that up front. I said, "This is for the wedding. Whatever's left over is yours to keep." I thought that was generous. I still think it was generous. What I did not expect was that the wedding would come to mean something different in their minds than it did in mine. The guest list started at 90 people. Then it was 140. Then it was somehow close to 200. The venue changed from a nice event space in Buckhead to a full buyout of a resort property in the North Georgia mountains, a place that cost $40,000 just for the weekend rental before food, flowers, or anything else. I sat with the numbers and I said, "Cooper, this is going over budget." He said Vanessa's parents were contributing. I asked how much. He was vague. I let it go, which was a mistake. 3 weeks before the wedding, Cooper came to my house on a Tuesday afternoon. He sat down at my kitchen table and he said he needed to talk to me about something. I made coffee. I sat across from him. He told me the wedding costs had run over what we'd planned. He said they needed more money. I asked how much more. He said another $110,000. I put my coffee cup down. I told him no. I told him I had already given more than most fathers would ever give, and that if the budget had ballooned to that degree, it was because decisions had been made without asking me, and I was not going to write a blank check to cover choices I hadn't agreed to. I said it calmly. I wasn't angry, not yet. I was just firm in the way that you get firm when you've been around long enough to know that giving in is not the same as being kind. Cooper left that afternoon without finishing his coffee. He didn't call me for 2 weeks. The night before the wedding, he called. He was friendly, almost too friendly the way people are when they need something from you, but want you to think they don't. He asked if we were good. I said we were good. I told him I was proud of him and I'd see him tomorrow. I went to bed thinking we had gotten past it. I drove up to the resort the next morning. It was a beautiful property. I'll give them that. Rolling hills, a stone terrace that overlooked a valley, the kind of scenery that makes you feel small in a good way. I found my seat among the family. I watched my son stand at the altar. I watched Vanessa walk down the aisle in a dress that I later learned cost more than my first pickup truck. I smiled through all of it because Eleanor would have wanted me to, and because on some level I still believed that once this was over, things would settle into something normal. The reception was where it went wrong. We were between the toasts and the dinner service when Vanessa appeared beside me. I was standing near the bar with my brother Gilbert and his wife. Vanessa looked composed, almost theatrical, the way someone looks when they've rehearsed what they're about to say. She leaned in close and told me she needed to speak with me privately. I excused myself from Gilbert and followed her to a corner near the door to the venue's back hallway. She told me she and Cooper had decided they wanted to move into my house. I thought I had misheard her. I asked her to say that again. She said it again. She said the house was too large for just me, that it was inefficient, that Cooper and she were starting a family. She paused there, and I understood that she was telling me she was pregnant, except she delivered it not as news but as leverage, and that it made more sense for them to have the house while I moved somewhere smaller, somewhere easier to manage at my age. She actually used that phrase, "at my age." I asked her where she imagined I would go. She said there were some very nice 55-plus communities in the area. I stood there for a moment. The music was playing behind us. Someone across the room was laughing loudly. I looked at this woman, my son's wife, who was now also technically a member of my family, and I felt something very cold and very clear settle over me. I told her no. She looked at me the way people look at you when they expected a different answer and can't quite recalibrate. Then she said that this was not really a request. She said Cooper and she had already spoken to someone about their options and that there were ways to handle the property legally if I wasn't willing to be reasonable. I want you to understand what she was saying. She was telling me at her own wedding reception, in a low voice so no one else could hear, that she was prepared to explore legal action against me over my home. The home I built. The home Eleanor and I raised our son in. I felt something I hadn't felt since the early days of the business, when suppliers tried to squeeze me and competitors tried to undercut me. It was the feeling of a door closing, quietly, calmly, with a very firm click. I looked at her and I said, "I need to make a phone call." She seemed to think I meant I was going to call someone who would fix this for her. She said, "Of course, take your time," with this small smile. I walked outside to the stone terrace. The valley was spread out below me, golden in the late afternoon light. I called my attorney, a man named Patrick. I've known him for 22 years. He handled Eleanor's estate. He is not a man who wastes words. I told him I was at my son's wedding, and his new wife had just told me she expected me to sign over my house or face legal action. Patrick was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Don't sign anything, don't agree to anything, and come see me Monday morning." I said I'd be there. I went back inside. I found my brother Gilbert, and I told him what had happened, quietly, in a way that wouldn't disrupt the reception. Gilbert is a straight-ahead man. He looked at me and said, "What do you need?" I said I needed him to remember this conversation, and I needed him to be a witness to whatever else happened tonight. What happened next was not what I expected, even after everything. I found Cooper near the head table. I touched his arm and asked if we could speak for a moment. He looked at me with an expression I hadn't seen on his face before. Not guilt, exactly, but something adjacent to it, something like someone who is uncomfortable, but has decided the discomfort is acceptable. I told him what Vanessa had said to me. I kept my voice level. I told him I wanted to hear it from him directly. He said, "Dad, we really do think it would be better for everyone." I asked him who everyone was. He didn't answer that. He said the house was a lot for one person. He said I didn't need 4 bedrooms. He said they'd be close by and could check on me. He said it like he was doing me a favor, like taking my house was a kindness. I asked him one more question. I asked him if he had any part in planning this conversation. Meaning, had he and Vanessa decided together to approach me tonight at the wedding in a moment when I might feel social pressure to agree? He looked down at his shoes. That was my answer. I told him I loved him. I meant it even then. I told him I was going to go back to my table, eat my dinner, and we would discuss this later. He looked relieved, as if he thought I was going to let it go. That was his mistake. I did eat my dinner. I spoke to relatives. I danced once with my sister-in-law because she asked, and she's a good woman who has always been kind to me, and I stayed until the cake was cut. Then I said my goodbyes and I drove home. Monday morning, I was in Patrick's office at 8:30. What Patrick told me reshaped what I understood about my own situation. He said that Vanessa's mention of legal options was almost certainly a bluff. There were no grounds for anyone to compel me to transfer my own property, but that the more important question was what I had in place to protect myself going forward. I had a will drawn up after Eleanor died that left everything to Cooper. Patrick asked me if that still reflected my wishes. I sat with that question for a long time. I told him it did not. We spent 2 hours in that office. When I left, I had initiated the process of changing my will, removing Cooper as the sole beneficiary, and establishing a trust that would put the bulk of my estate, the house, the remaining business equity, the retirement accounts, under the management of a trustee with specific conditions. Cooper would not be excluded entirely. He would receive a portion. But the majority would go to 3 charities that Eleanor had cared about: a local literacy program, a children's hospital in Atlanta, and the animal rescue organization where she had volunteered for years. I also called my business partner, a man named Dwight, who had been co-managing operations with me since I'd started to step back. I told Dwight what had happened. He had met Cooper and Vanessa at the company Christmas party the previous year and had formed his own impressions, which he had been too polite to share with me. He shared them now. He said he had wondered if Cooper might try to position himself in the business in a way that would push Dwight out. He had been watching for it. I told him we needed to revisit the partnership agreement and make sure everything was airtight. 3 days after the wedding, Cooper called me. He was cheerful in a way that seemed effortful. He asked how I was doing, said the honeymoon had been wonderful, They'd gone to Tuscany on money I was not going to think about, and then circled around to asking if I had given any more thought to the house situation. That was the phrase he used, the house situation. I told him I had given it a great deal of thought. I told him I would not be moving. I told him the house was mine. The title was in my name, and it would remain so for as long as I chose. I told him that his wife's comment about legal options had prompted me to speak with my attorney, and that in the course of doing so, I had also reviewed my estate planning documents, which I had updated. There was a silence on the line. He asked what I meant by updated. I told him I'd rather not get into the specifics over the phone, but that he should know my plans for the estate had changed, and that any assumptions he or Vanessa may have been operating under were no longer accurate. Another silence, longer this time. He said, "Dad, I don't understand why you're doing this." I said, "Cooper, I think if you're honest with yourself, you do understand." He hung up. He did not call again for 6 weeks. During those 6 weeks, I did some things I should have done years earlier. I had coffee with Gilbert every Saturday morning, which we hadn't done regularly since Eleanor died. I went through the business financials with Dwight and found 2 areas where Cooper had been steering referrals in a way that benefited a side project he had. A small property management company he'd started with Vanessa's cousin, without disclosing the arrangement to me. It was not illegal, but it was not right. I ended Cooper's informal advisory role with my company quietly and without drama. I simply stopped including him in things. I also did something I had been putting off for years. I cleaned out Eleanor's garden shed, not to erase her, but because I finally understood that keeping the shed exactly as she'd left it wasn't honoring her. It was avoiding the grief I hadn't finished feeling. I spent a Saturday afternoon in there, going through her seed packets and her old gardening gloves and the little ceramic markers she'd made herself in a pottery class, and I cried in a way I hadn't since the first year after she was gone. It was painful, and it was necessary. And I felt better afterward in the way you feel better when something that was stuck finally moves. Cooper and Vanessa came to see me 8 weeks after the wedding. They arrived together, and Vanessa looked different, less composed, less certain of the terrain. Cooper had a quality about him that I recognized as something close to shame, though he hadn't gotten all the way there yet. They sat in my living room. I offered them coffee. I sat across from them in the chair I've sat in for 30 years. Vanessa said she wanted to apologize for how the conversation at the wedding had gone. She said she had not meant to come across as aggressive. She said she was stressed and it had not come out right. I listened to the whole thing. Then I said, "Vanessa, I appreciate that. I want to say something to both of you, and I'd ask that you let me finish before you respond." They both nodded. I told them that I had built this house and this life over 40 years, mostly alongside their mother and grandmother, and that the assets I had accumulated were the result of work that neither of them had witnessed because they were not there for it. I told them that I had been generous with Cooper his entire life, not to hold it over him, but because I wanted him to have opportunities I hadn't. I said that generosity had been real and it had come from love, but that love and obligation are not the same thing, and somewhere along the way, I believed, Cooper had started to confuse the two. I told them the will had been changed. I told them the house would not be transferred. I told them that the door was not closed, that if Cooper wanted a relationship with me, I wanted that too, but that the relationship had to be built on something honest, and that what had happened at the wedding was not a starting point I was willing to pretend hadn't happened. Cooper's jaw tightened. Vanessa looked at her hands. Then Cooper said something that surprised me. He said, "I know, Dad, I know." It was not an apology exactly, but it was something. They left an hour later. I stood at the front window and watched their car back out of the driveway. It was a cold afternoon in January, the kind of flat gray that Georgia gets in winter, and the yard looked bare without Eleanor's garden in full color. But it was still my yard. My house, my 2 acres. The things we make when we're young and have no idea how much they'll matter when we're old. I have not changed the will back. I don't know if I will. That's not a decision made from anger. The anger passed fairly quickly, which surprised me. It's a decision made from clarity. When someone shows you who they are, you should believe them, not with bitterness, but with accuracy. Cooper calls every couple of weeks now. The calls are shorter than they used to be, and more careful, like someone navigating a path they know has soft spots. I take every call. I am always glad to hear his voice. I am not going to pretend last year didn't happen, but I am also not going to cut off my own son over something that can still, possibly, be repaired. Vanessa sends me a text on holidays. I respond. It is what it is. What I want to say to anyone listening to this, anyone who has worked for decades to build something and then found themselves wondering if the people around them see the work or just the result, is this. Being generous is not the same as being available to be taken from. Those are different things. I learned that later than I should have, and I learned it in a way that cost me something I can't get back. But I did learn it. Eleanor would have been furious about what happened at that wedding. She also would have told me to keep the door open for our son, because she always believed people could do better when they were shown what better looked like. I am trying to believe that too. The deed to this house is still in my name. The garden is still out back, bare in winter and green every spring. The cookbooks are still on the shelf. Some things you hold on to, not because you're afraid to let go, but because they're yours and you earned them, and no one gets to tell you otherwise. I've had a lot of time to sit with what happened, not to stew in it. I'm past that, but to actually look at it clearly, the way you can only look at something once the dust is settled and you are not reacting anymore. And what I keep coming back to is this. The situation with Cooper and Vanessa didn't come out of nowhere. It grew slowly, from a pattern I had a hand in building. I gave without conditions for a long time. I told myself it was love, and part of it was, but part of it was also avoidance. Every time I wrote a check instead of having a hard conversation, I was choosing comfort over honesty. I was teaching Cooper, without ever saying a word, that money was how I expressed care, and that it would keep coming, no matter what. That's not parenting. That's a transaction dressed up as affection. I see that now. It took a woman standing at her own wedding reception, telling me she had already spoken to a lawyer about my house to make me see it. There's a cause and effect to how people turn out, and it runs in both directions. Cooper didn't become who he showed me that evening in a vacuum. He became that person across dozens of small moments where I chose generosity over accountability. I'm not saying it's my fault. What he and Vanessa did was their choice, made by adults who knew better, but I contributed to the conditions. That's just honest. And being honest about it is the only way I know how to make sure I don't repeat the pattern with whatever time and relationships I have left. What I learned, what I'm still learning, is that real strength isn't in the giving. It's in knowing what you've earned and refusing to apologize for holding on to it. I built that house. I built that business. I sat in a garage in Decatur for years while other men my age were watching television. And I made something out of very little. That history doesn't disappear because someone decides it's more convenient for them if it does. Your history is yours. Your work is yours. No amount of smooth talk or legal posturing changes what you put in. And here's the other thing I've come to understand about people like Vanessa. People who approach the world as a series of negotiations where the goal is to end up with more than they started with. They are only as powerful as you allow them to be. The moment I said no, calmly, without flinching, the dynamic shifted. She had expected hesitation. She had expected me to weigh the social cost of refusing her at a wedding and decide it wasn't worth the scene. What she hadn't expected was a man who had already made peace with disappointing people when disappointing them was the right thing to do. That kind of steadiness, you can't manufacture it in the moment. It comes from years of practice. It comes from knowing who you are. I think about Eleanor a lot when I think about all of this. She was the wisest person I ever knew, and her wisdom wasn't the kind that came from books. It came from paying attention. She used to say that you can tell everything you need to know about a person by watching how they behave when they think no one important is watching. Vanessa thought I was just an old man with a house she wanted. She didn't consider that I'd spent 40 years learning how to read a room and how to make a decision under pressure. She misjudged what she was dealing with. That miscalculation was the beginning of everything that followed. I don't know what happens with Cooper from here. I genuinely don't. But I know that whatever happens, I won't pretend. I won't smooth things over to make someone else comfortable at my own expense. Not anymore. That season of my life is done. The deed is still in my name, and I sleep fine.